Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining me today as we begin this study on the book of Proverbs. And it's going to be, let me describe what it is that we're beginning today. I decided that I wanted to do something a lot more intensive than just a quick overview of the book of Proverbs. And I decided that because for the last, I want to say 2 years or so, I've been going month by month, day by day through Proverbs. And I've been taking the time to really examine the book and to look at every verse and try to find the connections and the relationships between the verses. It's not an easy thing to do. The book of Proverbs doesn't always lend itself very well to categorization, or you'll find in some books, in some of the letters of Paul, for example, or in the evangels, you'll find that in many places you can group like things together, and you can say, okay, in this section you're going to be talking about this topic, in this section you're going to be talking about this topic, or getting this. It's not that way in the book of Proverbs, with some caveats, which we'll go through as we go through the book. But generally speaking, Proverbs has, it definitely has order and structure, but you have to correspond verses from one chapter to another, and you have to look for major themes through the book of Proverbs. In some places, it's a lot more evident than others. But the bottom line is that whether you're looking for specific themes and categories, or you're looking at individual sayings, the book of Proverbs is simply amazing. And it imparts the kind of wisdom that in the day-to-day can really help us to live our lives in ways that are well-pleasing to Almighty Yahweh. So as I went through the book over the last couple of years, it's Proverbs, as I have indicated in the past, is nicely, it just so happens to work out very nicely in the way it was laid out in our Bibles, in our present-day Bibles, that it works out to be about a chapter a day, roughly, right? Usually there are about 30 days in a month, roughly, right? Give or take a day. And there are 31 Proverbs, so that works out to roughly one chapter of Proverbs a day, which is perfect bite size, right? I've always said to you that that I believe that if you really want to be strong as believers in Yahweh, if you really want to have impactful lives, if you really want to have very solid, practical, day-to-day wisdom that you can take with you and really improve yourself in terms of your spirituality, your morality, the discernment that you use in the day-to-day, when you're dealing with other people, when you're dealing with your parents, when you're dealing with your spouse, you're dealing with your children, your co-workers, whatever the situation may be. I've always said that if you go through the book of Proverbs and you make it a daily practice and a daily discipline, that you can't do better than that. And that's why Yahweh put it in there, right? Let's be clear. The book of Proverbs really isn't for non-believers, to be quite frank. And let me qualify that before anyone misunderstands me. I'm not saying that it isn't for everyone. It surely is for everyone. But it is more typical that a believer is going to look into it and glean its truths. Non-believers won't care what the book of Proverbs says, except maybe in a very peripheral way, right? So the book of Proverbs is mainly directed to the person who has made a commitment to Almighty Yahweh, who wants to gain wisdom, who wants to understand. To the person who wants to understand how to live in Yahweh, okay? So the book of Proverbs is going to be a treasure house, right? A store of treasure for the believer, for the person who wants to learn how to live prudently before Almighty Yahweh. And I'm going to take a lot of time, especially in these first couple of sessions, to go through some of the details about the background of Proverbs, who wrote it, where it came from, right? What the structure of the book is. So I want you to sit back and relax, and we're going to take it nice and slow. This is not going to be any kind of a rush, okay? This is not going to be any kind of a, is that going to still pick up my voice? Okay, very good. It's not going to be something that we're going to do, thank you. It's not going to be something that we do just to get through it, right? I want us to benefit from this in an amazing way. I want us to really deeply get into the book of Proverbs so that when you get through this, I'll call it a course, for lack of a better term, when you get through this course of Proverbs, you will be so engrossed with it, I hope, and so endeared to it that you will want to continue doing it every day of your life. I hope that's the case anyway, because if it sounds like I'm making a big deal out of it, it's because I am, right? I really mean this. If you truly give your attention to the book of Proverbs, if you truly learn how to use the book, if you truly understand the ramifications of the Proverbs, and if you use it, right, not just learn this intellectually. That's one way that you can read any biblical book. I never recommend that, right? Because reading the Bible is not an intellectual exercise. Reading the Bible is, in a very real sense, life itself, right? And I know that there are some people that won't feel that way, and hopefully none of us here, right? Because the whole reason that we read the scriptures is because Yahweh provided it as a manual for our living, so that we would know His mind. And the book of Proverbs very definitely shows you the mind of Almighty Yahweh. So if you really want to know how to live in a way that is pleasing to Yahweh, if you want to know how to have a great relationship with other people, if you want to understand morality, if you want to understand ethics, right? Things, between right and wrong, and how to make a decision between right and wrong, especially when it counts, right? There's one thing to know it, intellectually, but it's another thing to know something when it counts. If you want to know all those things and be able to do all those things, then you're going to pay very close attention to the book of Proverbs, and you're going to really invest your time and your energy in this book. And I promise you that it's going to be well worth every moment that you spend in it, okay? So I'm going to spend a lot of time giving you background and structure, and we're going to start that today. We're probably going to do very little in terms of looking at the actual text of Proverbs in the first couple of sessions. And by very little, I don't mean none at all. We're going to look at several of the verses, but we're not going to go in depth into those chapters until maybe around lesson 3, okay? And by the way, let me explain how this is going to work by the grace of Yahweh. We're going to do this every week, okay? Because it's a lot of material, and because it's that important, okay? On Sabbath, presumably we don't have anywhere to go, right? So I'm going to assume that you have at least 2 hours that you could spare each Sabbath, and we're going to start at the same time at 5 p.m. Eastern time, and we're going to go from 5 to 7 every week, unless there's something happening in between. We have the feast days coming up, and we're going to have to take a break then, okay? Or if there's something, we have to travel or whatever it may be, and even if I travel, I always try to, as long as I have internet, a good reliable internet connection somewhere, I won't miss a week. Because I really want to get through this material. And I'm going to make it at least 2 hours because it gives us a nice chunk of time to be able to digest this, so I don't have to fly through it, okay? I want to really be thorough with this because it's important material, and because and there are a lot of nuances in these verses that I think are going to be helpful to us in understanding the book. So settle in for the long haul, okay? I'm not going to drag it on unnecessarily. I say it's going to take about 4 to 6 months, only because you figure that there are 30 chapters, right? So that already there you're talking at least, if you figure 4 Sabbaths a month, we're going to be doing at least, to get through 30 Proverbs, you're going to be doing at least 7 months, right? If my math is right. Am I saying 7 months? Okay. But I won't need to go, there are some chapters I can get through, maybe you can do a couple of them, whatever. And I don't want to go beyond 6 months with this, because it is quite a long time. But I can't think of any better way to spend at least a couple of hours each Sabbath than to go through the book of Proverbs. So it's going to be available. If it's not going to be available on any given week, I'll make that clear on the Facebook page. So pay attention to the Facebook page. Always be looking. Make sure you check for the link. It will be a different link every time. It's not going to be just one room. So I'll be posting a different link every week. So you want to be careful to pay attention to that. If you want to invite other people, you could provide the link to them. Okay? If you find that the information is valuable and you want to invite other people, even if they're not on our Facebook page, by all means, share that link and let them come on. As I mentioned, when I first introduced the idea of doing this, I decided not to do this in a way where I would make the recording immediately available for each session, and I did that purposefully. I really feel that for when it comes to dealing with biblical topics, and something especially of this magnitude and this intense, I think it sometimes dilutes the purpose if you allow people to just kind of come whenever they want to come. I want you to be serious about this, which means I'd like you to be here in as much as possible every week. I'm investing a lot of time, for every 2 hours that I invest, I'm speaking very directly here. For every 2 hours that I invest presenting a topic to you, I spend, you can be sure, at least 10 hours preparing myself ahead of time. That's a lot of work for me. And I don't mind doing that. I love it because it's a great benefit to me as well. But I also feel that it is an issue of respect for my time and an issue of respect for your time and your peers that we do this on a regular basis, and that we don't do it where some people can come whenever they want and others when they don't want. So I'm being very direct here to say that I hope that you'll be able to come every week. If you can't make it every week, that's fine. Life happens, right? But just understand that there will be no recording made immediately available for this. Okay. What's going to happen is that once I have the whole thing completed by the grace of Yahweh, I will package it. I'm recording these, and I will package them together, and then I'll make the whole package available as a course, and I'll make it available at a reasonable price for anyone who wants to purchase it. Okay. I want us to take the word of Yahweh seriously, and I think that's one of the ways in which we can do that, by impressing it upon people, the importance of actually showing up and being invested in this material. Okay. So without further ado, let's start looking at some of the background of Proverbs. And I'm going to ask you to be patient, because we're going to take a little time, as I said, especially in these first couple of lessons, to look at the background, because you never want to approach a biblical book by just diving into the book. That's how you get a lot of false ideas, and how people misunderstand things and they interpret things out of context. You always want to understand a number of things about the book before you go into it, and that's true of any book, Proverbs included. You always want to understand who wrote the book. You want to understand the general time frame in which it was written. You want to understand the purpose for the book, and you want to understand certainly the major themes and the categories with regard to what the book is trying to show you. And we're going to talk about all of those things today, okay? And next time as well. So let's, and the way I will do this is I will go through, I'm going to be going through my own understanding of the text, but I'm also going to share with you from different resources that I come across with regard to Proverbs. And I'll name some of those resources as we go along. As a matter of fact, I'm going to start out by giving you a few of those so that you understand some of the context in which I'm covering this material, okay? So I'm using a number of books and resources, and I can always, at some point, I'll make these available to you in a bibliography form so that you can take a look at those sources should you choose to do that and go into them a little bit more deeply, okay? I think it's also important for me to give credit where credit is due. And you'll see that whenever I do any kind of a printout, I will always give the credit to the person from whom it came. So you're going to see that I'm going to be using material from some of these sources here. They may not mean a whole lot to you now, but just understand that that you need to know where these things are coming from. And by the way, I see that Zeta on the chat is my wife, Zeta. She's saying, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to go ahead and type them into the Zoom chat. I will not be paying attention to the Zoom chat while I'm doing this so that I'm not distracted. But if there are any major questions at the end, I will go and check that and see what I can answer. I can leave a few minutes at the end of each session to cover questions. And if I don't get to your specific question on the day, I will get back with you probably through the Facebook page, okay? So we're going to take a really good close look at the book of Proverbs. Let me tell you some of the sources that I'm using. One of the sources I'm using is there's a gentleman who's no longer alive. His name is Irving L. Jensen. And Irving Jensen, I first heard of him when I was taking a methodical Bible study course. And if any of you have ever had the material with me where you do the chart form, the chart of study of taking the biblical text and then breaking it up into chart form, into segments, and then coming up with the key center and the main themes of that comes from Irving Jensen's approach. And Irving Jensen, in addition to doing a book about inductive Bible study, which was a big thing for him, he also did specific Bible studies on particular books. And one of the ones that he did was on the book of Proverbs. So there are actually two resources I'm using from him. One of them is called Every Man's Bible Commentary on the book of Proverbs. And this one is called Proverbs, a Self-Study Guide. And I'll be using material from both of those. Of course, you all know that I'm a big fan of Charles R. Swindoll, Chuck Swindoll. And Chuck Swindoll wrote a couple of different books. One of them is a devotional book called Living the Proverbs. I'll be sharing some material from that. You also know that I have been a large proponent of what's called nouthetic counseling, biblical counseling that's based upon a Bible-based approach. And the main proponent of nouthetic counseling, really the father of nouthetic counseling, is a gentleman by the name of J.E. Adams. And J. Adams wrote an entire commentary set on the New Testament and also included one of the Proverbs. And I'm going to be using a great deal of that material. This is called the Christian Counselor's Commentary, and this one specifically is on the book of Proverbs. Great stuff. There are also some people who are very well-known scholars who have a lot of material, much of which I won't use because it's very technical, and a lot of material that I don't even understand because this really gets into the literary, the nitty-gritty of the text. But wherever it's useful, I get glean some things from that. There's a specific commentary, the New International Commentary on the Old Testament, and this one's on the book of Proverbs. And the author of that is Bruce K. Waltke, Waltke, So I'll be using a number of things from Professor Waltke, and there'll be other things as we go along, and I'll introduce those as we go along. Okay. Now, let's start off by talking about, we're going to look at the structure of the book of Proverbs in just a little bit. Okay, so this is the approach we're going to take. We're going to look at the general structure across the 31 books, right? Because there is structure to the book of Proverbs. So, I don't know if you're like me, and when you first started looking through Proverbs, it just seemed like a whole bunch of disjointed verses here and there. And it seems that way, but there really is not, there really is definite structure to the book of Proverbs. So we're going to talk about that in a little bit. I'm going to actually show you, and you should have received through Facebook, you would have seen 3 charts that I placed there, one from Chuck Swindoll and 2 from Irving Jensen, and we'll go over those a little bit later in the lesson today. If you did not download those, no worries. I'm going to share them on screen, and we can take a look at them together. And then when we're done with the study, then you can go to the Facebook page and you can download those. So I'm going to ask you to keep those, maybe print them off so that you can have them for future reference, because from time to time we will be referring to those charts so that we can kind of keep our place in the book of Proverbs. Okay. And by the way, consider yourself as having homework every single day for this course. And as you can imagine, here's the homework, right? You need to start reading the book of Proverbs every single day. I'm not going to collect it. I'm not going to grade it, right? How well you do in that homework and how much you get out of it is absolutely, positively, simply up to you. Every day, if you set aside 10 minutes, 15 minutes to read the book of Proverbs, the chapter for that day, and then to say a short prayer, you've already started your day off well. You've already begun with a devotional period that's going to set the tone in your mind for the day, right? So there was a time when my tone was set. This is how my morning started. Wake up, hear the alarm go off, wake up, probably turn it off 2 or 3 times before I actually wake up, right? Wake up, look at my phone, flip over to the news, and start setting the tone of my day, right? And there's one murder, and there's this nuclear proliferation thing going on, and here's this riot going on here, and here's this situation going on here. Okay, so by the time I actually got out of bed, right, where was I with tone? I was already done for the day, right? I just didn't know it yet. My mind was already focusing on all the murders and the mayhem and the bloodshed and all the things over which I have absolutely zero control, and that would already set my tone for the day. Yes? That's not the way I wanted to set my tone for the day. So I decided to quit it. And I have stopped that. Long time now I stopped that. So when I get up in the morning now, I get up, I see what time it is, phone goes back down. I go and I take care of my business, get ready to go. And then the first thing I do is I go and I sit down, and then I have my book of Proverbs. I have a stand that I use so that I can, read the book easier. The Bible goes on the stand, get my coffee, and I sit down. What's today? Today's August 12th, okay? Proverbs chapter 12, let's do it. And I've even gotten to the point in the past year, roughly, where I started out just reading the proverb every day, and in the last year, I've added reading commentary, right? So I read the proverb, and then I go to the corresponding commentary. Here's chapter 12 for today, 2 or 3 pages, giving some understanding, and I'm absorbing, and I'm learning, and I'm thinking, and my mind is gathering the wisdom that comes from Yahweh instead of the mayhem that comes from this world, right? And already my tone is being set. Does that mean I'm not going to have challenges during the day? Of course not, right? We're all going to have challenges during the day. That's precisely why you set the tone early on, because my very thoughts, waking up early in the morning, I want my very thoughts to be thinking about Yahweh. I want to be thinking like He thinks. I want to gain wisdom so that when I need it in the course of the day, I know where to turn. I can think, okay, I read something about that in the book of Proverbs. I remember a principle, right? And it's not that I'm, strategically, step by step, okay, step 1, step 2, step 3. It's just kind of happening in the back of my head, right? Which is what you want. You want to internalize this material. You want to take it with you so that you have it when you need it. That's what Proverbs is. Proverbs is portable truth. Right? Some people also use the book of Psalms. That's also a great thing to use for your devotional. As a matter of fact, it's interesting because a lot of people make this comparison. They'll say that the book of Psalms is sort of our record in the Bible of man's relationship to Yahweh. And then the book of Proverbs, and that's Psalms, right? Man's relationship to Yahweh, our devotions towards Him. And then the book of Proverbs is sort of a counterpart, man's relationship to other men, right? So you think about Psalms, it's kind of like the vertical plane that I referred to in the past, right? The vertical plane meaning from us to Yahweh, right? And then the Proverbs is kind of that horizontal plane, from us to men. How do we treat other men? How do other men treat us? And how do we have better relationships with other men? And of course, underlining everything in the horizontal, obviously, is the vertical, right? That goes without saying. In other words, the knowledge of how we treat other men is not just knowledge that we pull out of a hat. It's how Yahweh wants us to treat other men, right? So when we talk about the 2 greatest commandments, love Yahweh your Elohim with all your heart, soul, and might, and love your neighbor as yourself, what are we talking about? We're talking about the vertical plane, and we're talking about the horizontal plane, right? So the book of Proverbs is especially suited to help you on that horizontal plane. And we're going to talk a lot about that. Now, before we go into the structure of the book, I have a lot to say about the background. And for that, I'm actually going to turn to some things that I've written in the past. So just bear with me because I'm going to actually be reading some stuff, but hopefully it's not going to sound too didactic, like I'm just kind of lecturing at you. But it's important information to know. And I think that all of this is going to really, if you pay close attention, it's going to benefit you and you're going to really get a lot out of it. So please bear with me as I read through it. I won't read through the entire thing, but I want to read through most of it because this is going to be background information that's going to be helpful. And by the way, these first 2 lessons, because it is a lot of background, may be some of the more, how shall I put, it may be the lesser exciting of the material that we're going to do. Stay with it. Stay with me. Okay? Don't get turned off by that because most of what we're going to be doing literally after the introductory material is going through each chapter verse by verse and going through and getting the sense of every single verse in the book of Proverbs, of which there are about 915, okay? 31 chapters, 915 verses. So we have a lot of reading to do, all right? And a lot of interpreting to do. And I'm going to go through that by the grace of Yahweh, verse by verse. So just stay with me as I give you this background, even if it sounds a little professorial, right? Okay. So let's talk about, first of all, where Proverbs falls in terms of the whole Bible. So in the Bible is actually a library of books, right? It's kind of fascinating when you think about it because, you have 66 books, at least in the Protestant numbering of the books. And the Jewish numbering of the books it's more like, I want to say 39, I think it is. I can double check that. But it's because they combine, right? Like 1st, 2nd Kings just becomes Kings, 1st, 2nd Samuel becomes Samuel, etc. So, and of course, they don't have the New Testament in the Jewish Bible, so to speak. We will refer to as Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, right? Torah, instruction, or what's usually referred to as the law, but it's more like the instruction, the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch. Then you have Nevi'im, which are the prophets, and then you have the Ketuvim from the word katav, to write. The Ketuvim, writings, and the book of Proverbs is one of those that falls within the writings. These are things like Psalms, Job, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Proverbs, what we typically refer to as wisdom literature, right? So you have these different sections of the Bible, and which is an entire library of books. And then you have all the books of the New Testament that is not a part of that. But of all the Tanakh, the Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, we have the writings, right? So if you go over to, we're going to read many verses as we go through this material so that we can get a good idea of the context. So if you go over to Luke 24, Yahshua meets those walking on the road to Emmaus, right? And he says in verse 27, and beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself, okay? And then you see that in other places, it talks about, so he's referring to Moses and the prophets, right? But then he also talks about the Psalms. So if you go a little further over to verse 44 of the same chapter, he said to them, this is what I told you while I was still with you. Everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses, that's the Torah, the prophets, Nevi'im, the word Navi is prophet, right? The plural Nevi'im, and the Psalms, right? And the Psalms are indicative. The Psalms represent all of what are known as the writings, the Ketuvim, okay? So he's telling you what the Bible is, right? Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, the Tanakh. And then we know from other verses that the New Testament writings, the writings of Paul, etc., are also considered to be scripture, but in a different sense. But all of it together collectively is what forms our Bible, what forms our scriptures, right? So Yahshua recognizes the Psalms as representative of all the writings, and the Proverbs fall within that Ketuvim, that section of Bible. And as I said earlier, Job, Psalms, at least many parts of Psalms, and we won't go into that too deeply today, but many parts of the Psalms, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and several others fall under what are known as the writings, but they're also considered to be something called wisdom literature. Okay, in the Greek, hagiographa. Okay, so let me read, and I want you to pay close attention. So the sacred scriptures given to us by our Heavenly Father Yahweh are a complete guide for living for those who seek to live by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of Yahweh. The section of the scriptures known in the Hebrew as Ketuvim, translated writings, and in the Greek as hagiographa, or sacred writings, is comprised of a corpus of knowledge that seeks to impress upon us lessons necessary for our very survival. I don't use that in an exaggerated way. Indeed, within that body of knowledge, the section commonly known as wisdom literature holds a particular relevance to our existence. The books of the Bible that most often are considered to be a part of wisdom literature are Job, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes. However, others also include Song of Songs, several of the Psalms, and the Book of Lamentations. The wisdom literature given to us by Almighty Yahweh is intended to impart wisdom, hear me now, in a practical rather than simply a theoretical sense. That's very, very important where Proverbs is concerned. Proverbs is practical wisdom. It's not like wisdom that you hear about when you're studying, for example, Greek philosophy, which is the other probably major example in Western civilization of wisdom, right? It's not wisdom in a theoretical sense. It's wisdom in a practical sense. In other words, how you're living, which makes all the difference. That practical wisdom teaches us to make right decisions in our everyday living, decisions that are based upon the fear of Almighty Yahweh that will result in our good. The terms used in the Hebrew text to communicate the language of wisdom reflect the practical aspects of this section of the Bible. The literary forms of proverbial and speculative wisdom also demonstrate how practical versus theoretical knowledge is the intent of the wisdom literature, okay? And the historical record of applied wisdom, wisdom applied, right? Not just wisdom learned for the sake of learning, but wisdom applied in both the common individual and the religious leadership in Israel also illustrate the practical aspects of these words for our everyday living. Biblical wisdom literature is knowledge of a practical sort. Unlike the philosophy of the Greeks, biblical wisdom literature does not present knowledge simply for the sake of knowing, right? So if you look at something like Acts 17, right, where Paul is talking to the Athenians, what does it tell you? It tells you this is Acts 17, beginning around verse 19. Oh, by the way, the version of the Bible, so that you know, I don't think I've mentioned this to you. I'm using these days the New International Version of that was most recently updated in 2011. I decided to try to go to something that was a little bit more of a balance between the literalness of the scriptures and the readability. There's still certain issues with NIV, as there are with every major translation. By the way, anyone out there who tells you that there's a perfect translation, you better run from them as quickly as possible, okay? Because they're either flat out lying to you, or they're just they're too involved in their belief to really see the truth of it. So every Bible translation is flawed. That's why when you're studying, you really want to use several different translations. But I've become very comfortable with what I see in the New International Version. Has a very good balance. So that's the version I'm using, in case you're wondering. So I'm in Acts 17, verse 19. Then they took him, they meaning the people of Athens, the philosophers, right? Because verse 18, a group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with him. So these are the chief wisdom purveyors of Paul's day, right? So in verse 19, then they took him and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus. The Areopagus is what's also known as Mars Hill, where they said to him, may we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? Because to him, this teaching of the Messiah and the resurrection is a brand new teaching. He says, you are bringing some strange ideas to our ears, and we would like to know what they mean. And then in parentheses, in verse 21, all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. Very interesting. So here they are listening to the latest ideas, but the question, it kind of begs the question, okay, you're listening to the latest ideas, but now what are you doing with them, right? Are you just using them as a mental exercise? Are you just using them as a speculative exercise? Or are you using them to actually apply them in your everyday living? And that's what the book of Proverbs is meant to do. And all of wisdom, biblical wisdom literature is meant for you to do. It's meant to be practical, right? In other words, knowledge is presented to be acted upon. And you might say to yourself, well, yeah, that's obvious. Isn't it obvious to everyone? No, it isn't. It isn't. You have many people in this world that they like to have an intellectual conversation just because, it keeps their minds fresh and because it's interesting and it keeps life interesting. But in terms of actually taking stuff and putting it into practice, that's not as common as you would think. And that's what the Bible is meant for you to do in terms of its wisdom, right? So wisdom in the biblical sense then is the knowledge of Yahweh put into action. People say all the time, knowledge is power. That's not true. You hear it all the time. You have to question a lot of the sayings with which society is familiar. And society says knowledge is power. Knowledge is not power. Knowledge, more accurately, knowledge is potential power. When does knowledge truly become power? Knowledge truly becomes power when you act upon it. Otherwise, it just sits there. Otherwise, it's just an academic exercise. And when you act upon knowledge, then it becomes powerful, because at that point, you've now graduated from knowledge to wisdom, right? So I make a big emphasis of this because it's important to the understanding of the book of Proverbs, crucial to the understanding of Proverbs. Because here's why I say this. If you are the type of person, my friends, who listens not just to Proverbs, but who hears the wisdom of the Bible being taught during sermons, during studies, on the Sabbath, during the holy days, right? Or if you're listening to preaching on the radio, whatever it may be, or you're reading something, if you're listening to all this wisdom, but all you're doing is listening, and you're not making a part of yourself, you're not making it part of your everyday life, you're not using it to make decisions in the day-to-day, then you are not being a good student of the word of Yahweh. And I'll just say that flat out. You are a consumer of knowledge in a passive way, but you are not making any changes to your life. And if you are not allowing the scriptures to make changes in your life, if you are not taking proactive, right? If you're not being proactive, if you're not taking action to implement that wisdom in your life, then you're doing things in a very academic way and in a very intellectual way, and you may be very good at it. But how is it helping you to live? Probably not much. And you need, if that's you, you need to rethink that. You need to take that wisdom and figure out how to implement it in your life. And sometimes, because we're reading something that was written, hundreds and really thousands of years ago, we think that somehow it's so different, it was for them rather than for us. And nothing could be further from the truth. And I think you know that. It's for us. It's just we have to find the specific angle and how it's applied today, right? The principles that are in that word. So yes, maybe you don't do things in an agricultural sense, but you could still take a principle from that agricultural thing and apply it in the day-to-day today, right? It's just different today because of the culture, because of the sophistication of the culture and all those things, but it's no different in terms of the principles. People are no different. Like the book of Ecclesiastes, which is a wisdom book, right, says there's nothing new under the sun. And I assure you that that's the case from the beginning of time to the present day. Men are men, women are women, and human behavior is human behavior. It's just cultures and times that change, but the principles remain the same. This is why I always say to you, with regard to the way I, Carlos Del Toro, the way that I interpret the scriptures and impart it to you, my friends, is always by looking for principles. I don't try to look at the literalness of everything and then say, this is literally how you have to apply this, because to me, it's pointless to do that, because we're living in the here and now. How do you take those literal things and find the essence of what they mean so that we can interpret them in a way that applies in our lives today? Don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying to recreate something in our own image. No, far from it. I'm saying try to understand as best we can what the intent of that principle was. But you have to understand what it was in their day, and then when you understand that, then you can put the application in our day by applying the principle, okay? And you're going to find that quite frequently in the book of Proverbs. So biblical wisdom is meant to be applied. Indeed, the fear of Yahweh is the beginning of wisdom, and that is a key theme throughout the book of Proverbs. You see that over in Proverbs 9:10, where it tells you that the fear of Yahweh is the beginning of wisdom. And by the way, sometimes people try to explain this away, and they'll say something like, well, that fear isn't talking about a fear of being afraid of the Almighty. I disagree. I don't think that that's true at all. I don't think it's exclusively that, but I think that that's certainly an element of it. That fear, and we'll talk more about it when we get to the verses, but I just want to mention this, that fear is a healthy fear. You should fear someone that has that kind of power over you, that awesomeness that he created the heavens and the earth and those beautiful seas out there. You should fear that. You should fear what he can do to you and how he can change your life. I don't believe that that should be the driving motivation, because the fear that's being referred to here is more of a fear of awe, of reverence, of recognizing how huge, how grand he is, and how powerful he is. It's a healthy awe that you have. It's kind of the thing that you feel when you see the ocean for the first time, or you're in the middle of if you ever walked onto a beach in the middle of the night and looked upon the ocean and just kind of felt that dread that comes upon you. Or if you've been used to, as city folks, if you've been used to looking at the stars in the midst of a bunch of lights, and all of a sudden one day you're in a rural area and you look up at the sky and then you see the stars as they really are, and that resplendent beauty, and it strikes you. You know the feeling. You've all felt it before. You know that feeling of awe that overtakes you. It's the awe that makes you feel so small all of a sudden, right? I always like that quote that Kennedy used to have on his desk, in an engraving on his desk, where he says, "O Elohim," and of course he uses G-O-D. "O Elohim, your sea is so large, and my boat is so small." That always makes a big impression on me. I like to maybe even get one of those plaques one day and put it on my desk, because it's a nice reminder. That kind of awe that you get is what you feel with regard to the fear of Yahweh. Because when you fear Yahweh, right, then you know that you owe him your allegiance. You understand that we are insignificant in comparison, and that we owe him our complete obedience and our loyalty. But part of that fear also is an actual fear, right? Because we know that he can bring judgment. So don't miss out on that, and don't minimize that. Don't dilute that, because there are times when you're going to need to have that in your heart. When the only thing that maybe keep standing between you and following the temptation that's going to destroy the rest of your life, if the only thing that stands between you and that temptation that can ruin the rest of your life is, I'm afraid of what Yahweh can do to me in judgment, and you know what? Let that be the thing that stands between you and that temptation. That's a good fear. That's a healthy fear, right? The fear of a child with the parent, that you don't want to do something wrong because you know that there'd be consequences to that, right? So that fear of Yahweh is the beginning of wisdom. Why the beginning? Because unless you believe in the source of that wisdom, you're not going to be motivated to take any action. So as soon as you recognize, as soon as you acknowledge that you have that fear of Yahweh, then you're going to want to do what he says. And you're going to trust what he says because he has instant credibility with you. And that's what you have with the book of Proverbs. So the beginning of it all is to have that healthy fear. Once a person acknowledges Yahweh as the only living and true Elohim and begins to reverence him, that begins the journey towards wisdom. However, it's only the beginning. That individual must then apply himself to actively learning the specific ways in which he must live. This involves a lifelong process of learning wisdom that leads one to a successful life. And you see that also in places like James 1:5-8 and 2 Timothy 2:15. Bear in mind also that the biblical definition of success is not the secular definition, right? Success. Everyone views success in different terms, but oftentimes success is viewed as the accumulation of things. That's not the biblical definition of success. There's nothing wrong with the accumulation of things, right? And there are some people who think that there are, but there aren't. There isn't. I guess is the correct grammatical thing. There's nothing wrong with looking for success in terms of, accumulating wealth, right? But if that becomes your primary focus to the exclusion of everything else, then that is a problem. Okay. Now, some people may disagree with me. That's okay. You can disagree with me, but when we go through the book of Proverbs, I think you're going to find that what I'm saying is borne out by many of the passages there. Consequently, although wisdom literature also abounds in other Near Eastern cultures, for example, ancient Babylonia was famous for wisdom, and Egypt. Matter of fact, there's an entire section of the book of Proverbs that many scholars say, well, that's very similar to these things of the Egyptian wise men. But of course, Solomon would have taken those, even if he did have those in his days, and he recast them in terms of how Yahweh would want us to understand those things. And we could talk more about that when we get to it. There's a major difference, right? Even though there may be some similarities. While those cultures taught wisdom for the sake of having successful lives in regard to material possessions, family, property, good health, etc., the Bible makes it clear that one can only enjoy true success if his life is lived in pursuit of those things that draw him closer to Yahweh. In other words, having good health, possessions, family, etc. are all good and well, but are subservient to the greater good of giving Yahweh the glory through lives that reflect a righteous character. If you're a kind of person who has all kinds of material wealth, then the world is full of those kind of people, right? But yet they have no regard for something greater than themselves. And if you don't have regard for a power greater than yourself, chances are that you probably have less regard for the horizontal plane between people, because then it becomes all about what I can get regardless of what everyone else around me is doing or being, right? And that can be problematic. The biblical text reflects this practical aspect of wisdom literature. And we're going to go into some terms here. There are 9 specific terms, and we'll talk more about them as we get to chapter 1, but I want to introduce them here. There are 9 specific terms used throughout the wisdom literature that relate to each other in a sense that clearly demonstrates the practical nature of these teachings. Okay, so I'm gonna share my screen here for a moment, and we're going to be doing this frequently as we go through the studies. And I'm going to write some things down. So just bear with me as I do that. So the main word that translated wisdom, is the Hebrew word chokmah. And I'm just going to transliterate it as best I can, okay? Can everyone see that? Chokmah. Okay, if you can't see it, then Zeta can text me, but I think we're good. All right. Chokmah is and if you're looking for this in the Strong's dictionary, you'll see that it's number 2451, okay? And the word chokmah means wisdom in the truest sense, right? And it comes from the word chokam or chakam, right? Which is a prime root that means to be wise in mind, word, or act. The next word is the word mashal. And the word mashal is a word that means, is usually translated to rule, reign, or have power. But get this, it's a word that has to do with a likeness or comparison. Now, the word mashal is important because, quite frankly, that's the word upon which the biblical book of Proverbs is named. The term for book of Proverbs is mishlei, plural, mishlei. The singular is mashal, which is this word here. And the word mashal means a likeness or a comparison. It's something like something else. So it's comparing A to B, right? B to C. It's a comparison. And the connection with ruling or reigning and having power is what? Is that a ruler or reigner discerns, right? A ruler or reigner makes decisions, and they make decisions between this and that, right? That's the connection. Now, the English word that we use, Proverbs, it's interesting. This also, it comes from two portions of, two words. The word pro, which means for something, right? It's for something or in place of or in lieu of something. For. It's kind of like when you think of the term, and also it could also mean forward, right? Pro, forward, towards something. But the term pro means more like that this is in place of something else or for something. For example, we hear the term pro-choice, right? And you understand the implications of pro-choice, pro-life, right? It's in that sense, pro. And then the verb verba, right? The word verba, which means verb, right? Word, for words, in place of words. What is the meaning of that? Well, Proverbs, each unit of a verse of Proverbs is a particular pithy short saying that's communicating a greater truth. And I'm going to talk a lot more about this in a little bit. But when you have a short, one sentence saying, it's taking the place of many words. Because in that one sentence, you're giving a whole story, basically, about what you should believe about that particular ethical idea or that particular moral idea. And that's what the word proverb means. It means that you have these short, pithy sayings that are in their shortness, right, substituting for many words. It's almost like it's saying in English in terms of imagery, it's almost like saying a picture is worth 1,000 words. That's what a proverb does. And a proverb can appear in a number of different ways. It can appear as what's called an aphorism, which is what we know as a short little saying that has some meaning, of something that you should do. It's trying to communicate a meaning to you. It can come in the form of a parable, right? So when you look at Yahshua's parables, that there's short allegory type sayings, those are also moshals, each and every one of those, right? Allegories or moshals, comparisons, contrasts. These are all they're showing this is like that, or this is not like that. And we'll talk more about that later, okay? But the word mashal is the word that's very commonly used for likeness. It's and then you have this word here, the word da'af. Oh, by the way, the word mashal, if you're looking for it in a concordance, either Strong's or Brown Driver Briggs or something like that, it's number 4910. Okay. The word da'af is another word, and the word da'af, number 1847, is a word that means knowledge, but in the sense of it could have a further extension of cunning, knowledge or cunning. And by the way, that's related to the Hebrew word yodah, which is the word to know. It's a prime word that means to know. Matter of fact, it's interesting, when you look at the term for sexual relations, the root word is yodah, right? Because the closer that you know, it represents the greatest intimacy with someone that you know deeply, right? The word yodah means to know. So the word da'af is a word that means knowledge or cunning, okay? Then you have the word binah. Understand I'm transliterating these, right? From the Hebrew. The word is number 998. And the word binah is translated simply as understanding. But it's more than just understanding. It has root in the word bain, which is the prime root that means to separate mentally or distinguish. So I'm going to say here to separate mentally or distinguish. You're making a distinction between one thing or the other. And why am I taking the time to go through all these words? Because a lot of times you look in the English translation and it uses words like understanding, know, wisdom, and it looks like it's all the same thing, and it's not. Each of these words conveys a meaning that is important to our understanding of the book of Proverbs, and especially in the first few verses where Solomon himself, who wrote the book, gives you the reason why he delivered these proverbs, and it was to be able to pass along all these things, to make comparisons, to promote knowledge, understanding. And with this word binah, it's understanding, where you are learning to make a distinction between one thing and another. It's not this, but this. Or if you do this, this is going to be the consequence, right? It's making a mental distinction or separation between one and the other. As a matter of fact, there's a blessing that is used in Judaism to end the Sabbath. It's known as the Havdalah. And the Havdalah, it's the way you separate from holy time of the Sabbath going back into common time, right? And into the common week. And the blessing includes the words bain, between this and that, because you're making a distinction between the holy and the profane, right? Okay. So binah, understanding. Then you have the fifth word, which is the word lave. And the word lave is number 3820. And that is the word commonly translated as heart. And I'll have much more to say about this later. But the word heart, in the sense that it's not talking about the physical muscle in your body, right? But of course, it's heart used in a figurative sense for the feelings, the will, and even more importantly, not even so much the feelings, but the intellect that causes the feelings. In other words, the heart is the seat of your thinking, right? And it's very, very, very important to understand that. But if you go to Proverbs 4:23, which is a favorite verse of mine, Proverbs 4:23 says, above all else, guard your heart, guard your lave, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. In other words, guard your mind, guard your thinking, guard your intellect, because everything, it's going to determine your feelings, and your feelings are going to lead to your actions. And if your heart isn't right, then your actions are going to follow, right? And it's all about making sure that your heart is right with Yahweh. So that lave is very, very important, okay? Then you have, so this is really like the intellect, okay? I'm writing all this down because when it comes time to make this available, I want these things written down so you can have a written record of them, okay? Then you have the word orma, which is number 6195. And the word orma is translated trickery, right? But in the good sense, it could be discretion, right? In the sense that we're looking for it is that way, in discretion, right? But it could also mean guile. You know, so many times some of these words, depending on the usage and the context, is going to depend, right? Is it talking about trickery, or is it talking about discretion? Well, the ways in which we want to use it, right? We want to use it in the sense of discretion, yes? And we are understanding the discrete nature of something rather than the cleverness in a sense of guile, right? So if you look, for example, and so it can mean prudence, is what I'm saying, right? It can mean, there are a number of variations, and depending upon context, it can lead you to a negative or a positive thing. It can mean subtlety, right? I'm sure I'm spelling this wrong, but let's see, subtlety. I hope that's right, subtlety. It can be being wily, right? So it's interesting, if you look in the book of Genesis, and you look at Genesis 3, it tells you that the serpent was cunning, right? Well, the word that's used there is a variation of this, aruma, okay? And then the last word here, let's move this over a little bit, this up. The last word here is the word sakal, number 7919, and the word sakal means to cause or to be circumspect, and hence intelligent. gives you the implication of someone becoming an expert, right? And to be able to prosper on the basis of that. Also, prudence, having good sense, right? So you have these. I said that there would be, I think this is 9 terms. This is number 8, right? So we have, just going back, we have chokmah, moshal, da'af, bina, lev, or ma, sokal. And then the 8th word is related to sokal. Whoops. What did I do here? Okay, da'af. Okay, so sokal is a related word, which is number 7922. It's sekel. Okay, and the word sekel is a variation of sokal, and it means intelligence. By implication, success. Discretion also, okay. So similar to some of the other words. And the 9th word is musar, and that is number 4148. And the word musar is chastisement, reproof, right? This is correction, yes? Warning, instruction, and all kinds of variations of that, okay? So these are 9 terms that we'll return to when we discuss chapter 1 in full, okay? But let me say this. All these words and their definitions point to a body of knowledge that is intended to be used on a daily basis in a practical fashion, right? So with moshal, you are making comparisons from one thing to the next, okay? And also da'af, it's that knowledge in a very deep sense that can be even interpreted as cunning, right? To be able to really sense whether something is right or not. Bina, having the sense of knowledge that gives you the ability to distinguish between one thing and the next. Lev, the heart, that you're really in your intellect and you're really in your deepest inner being understanding something, right? Or ma, you're being that one, discretion, prudence, subtlety. I know I spelled that word subtlety wrong. Subtle, I think it's like this. Hold on a minute here, because it's drawing my eye. I can't seem to get to it now. Okay. All right. Anyway, someone's gonna have to show me eventually how to correct that, because that word that's not the way subtlety is spelled. So I'm going on record saying that. All right. So subtlety, or ma, is you have to have a certain degree of number's 9, okay. Number 9, let me bring that up a little bit. Let me stretch this out. Is that a little bit better? Okay. So, or ma, you have to be a little bit cunning, right? You have to have a little bit of discretion, not in a bad sense, but you have to be willing to put yourself in a place where you know if someone's trying to get over on you, right? That's what I'm trying to get at. So the word ma is that. It's having that sense that the naive person does not have that, right? You have to develop a certain sense of cunning, of guile, not in a bad sense, but in the sense that you can tell if someone's trying to pull wool over your eyes. That's what the word ma is communicating to you. And then sokal, circumspect, right? In other words, you're taking into account a lot of different things. You're exercising prudence. You're exercising expertise, right? And the related word sekel, intelligence, success, discretion. And then finally the word musar. You have to understand how to accept reproof, warning, instruction, chastisement. And I spelled the word instruction wrong too. And for some reason, I'm not able to go in here and edit this text. So I'll have to work on that. All right, can you see that now? Yep. Very good. All right. So all these words point to this overall body of knowledge to help you to be a better thinking person, to get away from being a naive person, right? And learning how to be a wise person, the chokam, right? We're not going to talk about it today, but we're going to go over in very great detail the the biblical word for fool. And this is one of the problems, again, of English translations, is that you see the word fool, and it's translated, there are at least three different words for fool, each with different connotations, and each one of them pregnant with meaning of a specific aspect of being a fool that does not necessarily come across in the English translations. And sometimes it's separated, sometimes it'll specifically say the naive or the scoffer, for example. But a lot of times something will just be translated fool, and yet you're left in by the context to determine which kind of fool it's referring to. And that's important because, and this is going to sound terrible, but not all fools are alike, okay? And you need to understand that, right? Because right now, and hear me carefully, I don't want anyone to feel insulted, right? But I'm going to say it very bluntly. You may be a fool right now, but you don't know which one that you are. I may be a fool. And under certain circumstances, we act like fools. But we don't understand why or in what way, okay? And I'll give you a shade of meaning of what I'm talking about here. There's the kind of fool that's a fool because he just doesn't know any better, because he's inexperienced. It's not because he's bad, it's not because he's unwilling, it's because he just doesn't know, right? And this is typically a young person that doesn't know something. And in that particular aspect of life, they are foolish because they do not know, right? But then there are people who know, who are older, more experienced, who have the experience, who are not naive. They're not that type of fool, but they're a different type of fool. They're a fool that they know what to do, and yet they choose not to do it. And that's the word, in my opinion, most often where you and I fall. And it's not that we are that in general, right? But we act foolish. We make decisions sometimes knowing better, and yet we still act like a fool. The book of Proverbs is mainly going to it's going to be the source of really helping you to change from being the fool to the wise person. And for the naive person, same thing. The naive person can become not naive by gaining experience, and that experience being put into practice along the lines of the wisdom described in the book of Proverbs. And the fool, the second type of fool, will also be helped by Proverbs because they're going to understand that they need to be more obedient to what it is that they're learning. They have to stop thinking about it intellectually and start putting it into practice, and then they'll be wise also. Now, the third person is a much different story. The third person is known variably as the scoffer or the mocker. There's not a whole lot of hope for the scoffer or the mocker. Not even the book of Proverbs is going to help the scoffer or the mocker. The scoffer or the mocker in the book of Proverbs is in there as a cautionary tale, because that's the one who knows the truth but chooses not to put it into practice in their lives, and they try to drag everyone else down as well because they're obnoxious and arrogant, and they have no regard for the word of Yahweh. And unless they have a major shift in their thinking and a major repentance and turning back to the truth, that person has no hope. So we'll talk about all those types of fools when the time comes. But all these words are meant to give you a sense of street smarts, right? That's what the book of Proverbs is meant to give you. It's meant to give you a sense of street smarts, a sense of discretion so you can make appropriate choices in life. So basically, biblical wisdom is the art of being successful, of forming the correct plan to gain the desired results. Its seat is the heart, the center of moral and intellectual decision. And this is a concept that I gained from a fellow by the name of D.A. Hubbard in his book, in his article, Wisdom in the Illustrated Bible Dictionary, right? The seat of wisdom is the heart, the center, which is the center of moral and intellectual decision. The heart is considered the seat of intellect from which morality, or the lack of it, comes forth, right? So a heart trained or disciplined in righteousness makes one prudent in everyday living. So that's what Proverbs is meant to do. It's practical training of your heart in righteousness to make you prudent in the day-to-day. And insofar as an individual can plan to make the right decisions in his or her personal life, the wisdom of Yahweh also provides the understanding necessary to officiate in a public function, right? So in other words, if you aspire to leadership as well, there's much that the Bible has to say about that as well. So it talks about it in terms of administrators of government, such as King David and King Solomon and Joshua the general in Deuteronomy, etc., that they had wisdom, right? But leadership in any scenario, at work, right? If you want to aspire to better leadership at work, and of course, in that greatest of organizations, the family, right? The most common one, you're also exercising leadership as a mother, as a father. as a husband, as a wife, right? And if you can learn these things, you'll not only be better as an individual, but you'll also be a better leader. The main literary forms in which the wisdom literature is presented also point to the practical nature of that knowledge, right? Wisdom literature is generally presented in two forms, proverbial and speculative wisdom, right? So let's talk about the first class, which is what mainly we're going to be focusing on, proverbial wisdom. That consists mainly of short, concise sayings of an instructive nature. And undoubtedly, the book of Proverbs is the prime example of this type of wisdom, right? Remember, at the word mashal, from which the Hebrew name of the Proverbs is derived, means to liken or compare. And I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to go back just to my main thing here. Okay. So the word mashal, from which the Hebrew name of the book of Proverbs is derived, means to liken or compare. The original oral sayings, right, before they were written, the original oral sayings that would be passed on from teacher to student had to be memorable and vivid in order to be committed to memory, right? So the proverbial wisdom is didactic in nature. The word didactic has to do with teaching, is to make them teachable, often making comparisons by means of a literary poetic device called parallelism. Before I talk about parallelism, let me say this. I wanted to go back to the whole concept of the book of the word mashal, M-A-S-H-A-L, and for this I want to turn to give credit where credit is due to Jay Adams, who has just a wonderful explanation in this commentary on Proverbs about how the Proverbs are meant to be read and understood. And I'm going to read from this book here. Listen to this very carefully. Very important. So he says the process of compacting truth tightly into one unit is like this. And what does he mean by compacting truth? Proverbs is meant to be portable truth. In other words, you're supposed to be able to take this with you wherever you go. That's how it was done originally orally, right? When it passed on from teacher to student, it was done orally because there weren't a lot of writings going around, right? People didn't, not everyone wrote, and there weren't books widely available as they are now, right? You could have just walked around with your iPhone and then look up something when you wanted to look it up. You had to know it. So the way that you knew it was by hearing it from your teacher, typically. And there are many methods to teach. Any good teacher knows this. And one of the best ways that a teacher can teach something is by getting a person to see a mental picture of what it is that they are trying to accomplish, right? So, because a picture is worth 1,000 words, right? So maybe you're not doing a physical picture, but you're creating a mental picture. And that mental picture is going to stick with the person, right? So listen in. So the process looks something like this. The writer structured the proverb, and I'm reading directly from Adam's book. The writer structured the proverb out of particulars from which he formed a generalization that he applied to one particular, in which he encapsulated the generalization in the form of a pithy proverb. Now stay with me. I know this is crazy, right? Sounds crazy, but stay with me. From which in turn, by crazy, I don't mean, whoo. I mean, it's just really a tongue twister type of thing. This is kind of all over the place. From which in turn, the interpreter must again abstract the generalization behind it and then apply it to that or any number of other particular situations to which it also validly applies. And everyone's going, huh? All right, let me translate this. He's saying that the writer of Proverbs does this. He uses a particular example of something that is happening as a representative example of a general concept. Right, is what I was talking about earlier when I talked about principles, right? We're learning principles. He took a general example that's easy to understand, a particular example of something that very specific that's easy to understand, but it's not meant to apply just to that one specific thing. It's meant to represent a larger truth, a generalization, right? He encapsulates the generalization with that small example. And then the interpreter, you, me, the person who's listening, has to then take that generalization, that principle that you learn from that example, and then apply it to any number of smaller examples. Because that generalization is going to apply to a bunch of different things in your life, not just to one thing. So in other words, it's kind of like, see if I can describe something in the modern day. It's kind of like, it's almost like taking something that's dried, right? Any scientists among us who know about desiccated materials and that, right? So it's like taking a sponge that's dry, right? It's not exactly the same thing. I'm just trying to give you a mental image. It's like taking a dry sponge. You ever seen a dry sponge? It's very small, very compact, right? And then you go and you put it in water, and all of a sudden it fluffs up and it compacts, right? If you want to carry around a sponge with you all the time, a wet sponge, it'd be very inconvenient, right? You'd have to. It's heavy, right? It's messy. You have to carry it around with you everywhere you go. It's much nicer to have a very small, compacted, very light. You've all felt a sponge that's dry, very light, compact sponge, and then you take it with you, pack it, very easy, very non-messy, and then when you get to the place where you need it, then you open it up and then you use it, right? Or you think about dried food rations, right? We have some military folks among us, right? So the rations, some of them anyway, come in a dry form, right? They're compact and they're what's the term I'm looking at? They're condensed, right? And they come in a dry form. And then when you take them out of the package, because it's easy for portability, and then when you take them out of the package, then you add water, and then it puffs up, and all of a sudden you have, right? How about our ramen noodles, folks, our students out there, right? Ramen noodles, you go, you add water, you boil, boom, all of a sudden they expand, yes? This is what we're talking about here in a certain way, right? So the proverb, if you think about it as that dry sponge that you take with you, and then when you need it, you add water and it expands, then you get the full use of that. It's kind of like what we're talking about. Let me give you an example so you can see. So if you go to 1 Corinthians 9:9, this is not for a proverb, but this is just another passage of scripture. And this is what I mean when I talk about principles. Same concept, right? So stay with me, same concept. So 1 Corinthians 9:9, Paul is trying to teach something, right? And he says, and we're all familiar with this example, I think. He says to the Corinthians, and I'll start with verse 7 for context. He says, who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard and does not eat its grapes? Who tends a flock and does not drink the milk? Do I say this merely on human authority? And by the way, even for better context, verse 6, or is it only I and Barnabas who lack the right to not work for a living? In other words, Paul is trying to make a case here for something, right? You have to look at the context. He's trying to make a case that some people are criticizing him for going about and work and doing the ministerial work and not having time to go and he's accepting gifts for doing the ministerial work. And he's making a case that he and Barnabas and the other ministers are worthy of being paid for their work because they don't have time to go and do all the work that everyone else does in the day-to-day. And this is their work. This is the heart of their work. This is how they can get their work accomplished for Yahweh. So he's trying to make a case that for the people who are being critical of him and Barnabas and others, that they are within their rights to accept donations to do their work. And he says, who serves as a soldier at his own expense? The soldier gets paid to do his work. He doesn't just do it, just to do it. Who plants a vineyard and does not eat its grapes? In other words, you benefit from the fruit of your labor. Who tends a flock and does not drink the milk? Do I say this merely on human authority? Because some people say, well, that's just your opinion, Paul. So he says, no, it's not just human authority. Let's go to scripture. Doesn't the Torah, doesn't the law say the same thing? For it is written in the law of Moses, do not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain. Now that's an agricultural concept. Do not muzzle the ox while it is treading out the grain. Is it about oxen that Elohim is concerned? Surely he says this for us, doesn't he? Yes, this was written for us, because whoever plows and threshes should be able to do so in the hope of sharing in the harvest. If we have sown spiritual seed among you, is it too much if we reap a material harvest from you? If others have this right of support from you, shouldn't we have it all the more? So what is he doing? He's taking an agricultural concept and saying, well, he's not saying it wasn't at all written for agriculture. That's not his point. He's saying it wasn't only written about agriculture. It's written as a scriptural principle, which Paul, is now taking and putting it into a spiritual context to prove his point. It is a portable truth that he is appealing to in scripture to show that this doesn't have to do only with agriculture. This is a principle that applies even more so in our situation. In other words, if you prevent me and other ministers from being recompensed for doing this work is not going to happen, because it's going to be the equivalent as if you were taking a muzzle and put it on an ox. The ox can't do his work if he's muzzled. We can't do our work if we're muzzled. How can we be muzzled if we don't have the economic means by which to do this work? Because we can't get anywhere. We can't do anything, you see? So it's a principle that he's using, that he's applying, so in a very specific situation. And yet, this principle could be used in other situations as well. So this is an example of taking one specific verse and using it for an overall generalization that in his case has to do with holding back these ministers from doing their work. And is very similar with Proverbs. So what you're doing with each of these Proverbs is you're taking a single proverb or a unit of Proverbs, and you are deriving a spiritual principle from it that you can apply in any number of other situations. And as we get to the actual text, I'll explain more of that and point out different examples, okay? In other words, I keep using the term, Proverbs is portable truth. It's compacted so that it's easily memorized. It's often vivid, it's picturesque, it presents a picture in your head so that it can be readily learned, and as J. Adams says, carried about in one's mind and then applied to any number of life situations as they occur, okay? And why? Why does this work? Because the picture's worth 1,000 words. Because just the way the human mind works, you can give a principle, right? And you could state it in a very bland narrative form of way, and it wouldn't be memorable to someone. They might remember it later, a month later, 2 months later, if you point it out to them. You say, hey, remember when I said this in a sermon, right? This is the preacher's nightmare, right? The preacher and the teacher's nightmare is, how do I get this information? How do I convey this information to people in a way that's going to be real to them today? It's what I call being in the milieu, which actually I got from J. Adams, right? And it's not original with me. How do you get people in the milieu? Because here's what happens. You start to preach, and you have all these wonderful concepts, and you spend a lot of time putting them together. And when you put them out there, if you've done your job well, it sounds great. And people listen and say, wow, that's just so eye-opening. It's insightful. And then what happens? Then they go out to work the next day, right? They go out to school, and then they completely forget all the principles, right? Why? Because they're not in the milieu. So, so that sermon that you heard about, about being able to defend your faith, that's all great, very intellectual, sounds great. When do you need it? You need it at a moment when you actually have to defend your faith, right? Well, all of a sudden now, that non-believer that you're talking to at work questions your faith and challenges you, and now you're scratching your head saying, what did I learn 2 weeks ago about, where to go in the scriptures, about this, that, or the other thing? You see, because you didn't learn, you didn't internalize the principle, right? When does your, and no offense to any of my children, but when does your child learn how to use, a checkbook? When you're explaining it to them, right? And here's what you do. Steps 1, 2, and 3, right? No, when do they need it? When they're actually writing a check, right? Then all of a sudden it becomes important. Then they have to pick up the phone and, hey, I remember you said a few things, but right? And that's just human nature. That happens to all of us. So the book of Proverbs is meant to give you portable, pithy, short, concise sayings that are loaded with truth, so that you take them with you, so that when you need them, you're able to come and remember them because they're so vivid in your mind, because they often paint the word picture, and good teachers do that, right? Including in sermons. They'll give you a story. That's why someone like Chuck Swindoll is wonderful in preaching, because he'll give you a story and you'll get it right away, right? It's like J. Adams gives a great example, right? Which is easier to have in your thinking? Which is easier to remember? The principle that doing a good deed in the wrong way or at the wrong time ruins the good deed? I could teach you that, right? I could teach you, hey, folks, keep in mind that doing a good deed in the wrong way or at the wrong time ruins the good deed. That's sound advice, right? That you could do a good deed, but if you do it in the wrong way, you do it at the wrong time, it's kind of worthless, right? Because it's going to backfire on you maybe. So you might listen to that and say, that makes a lot of good sense. But guess what? It's not very memorable, right? But what about Proverbs 27:14, which says this: he who blesses his neighbor with a loud voice rising early in the morning will have it reckoned to him as a curse. Much different story, right? Can you see it? Can you see yourself? Can you see yourself? Can you see yourself lying in bed after a long week, sleeping soundly, and all of a sudden one of your best friends comes on over and, hey, how you doing? Come on up. The weather's great, right? Yeah. How friendly do you feel towards that person, right? Even though they have your best interests at heart, right? You can see it, right? So the picture, the word picture, the humor, the bitingness. So sometimes you have some of these proverbs that are biting, right? And they say, that the lazy person is, he won't even, he's so lazy he won't even lift if he puts if he dips his bread in the meal, and he won't even bring it to his mouth because he's so tired and so lazy that he doesn't have the strength to bring it to his mouth, right? It brings you a picture, so it doesn't just talk about a lazy person. It shows you the lazy person. It gives you the picture so that you can remember it, and then you can apply that principle whenever you need it, okay? So Proverbs are meant to start getting you to think, to make you make comparisons between this and that, contrast between this and that. Now, I mentioned I talk about parallelism. What's that all about? Well, we've all learned about what the word parallel, right? In math, what is parallelism? It's this concept where you have something side by side and they're kind of equidistant, right, at all the points, and they never meet. But the point is that parallelism, they're parallel. They go together with one another, right? So if you're looking down a road and there's an obstruction in the road, you try to find a road that's parallel, right, so that you can go to the same destination without missing a beat and going off in all kinds of directions, right? That's kind of worthless advice in DC, by the way, but it happens, okay? So you try to find a parallel road. So that's what you get here in Proverbs. You get parallelism, but they're parallelisms of different types. Various means of parallelism can be found in the book of Proverbs. For example, antithetical. Antithetical means that you have contrasts, right? Where the second line suggests an idea that's opposite to the first. And some people go, take all kinds of time to explain these in really great detail, and they show you all the different variations. I don't think that's necessary. I think it's enough to understand conceptually that the writer of Proverbs, right, makes attempts to make these much more interesting and engaging by using these different literary devices, particularly with regard to parallelism. So Proverbs 10:5, for example, says, "He who gathers crops in summer is a prudent son, but he who sleeps during harvest is a disgraceful son." That's antithetical, right? That's an idea that's opposite to the first, right? Prudent son, disgraceful son. Gather crops in summer, sleeps during harvest, right? So it's an opposite. Then you have something called synthetic parallelism. You all know what the word synthesis means, right? Synthesis means that you take one piece, another piece, you synthesize and you put them together to have a greater piece, right? So synthetic, in which the second line completes the thought of the first. So let's look at Proverbs 16, and then we'll speak more about this as we get into the text, but this is a good overview, I hope. Proverbs 16:18. "Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall." Pride, haughty spirit, they're connected, right? So you could just stop and say pride goes before destruction, but it's much more powerful when you continue the thought, right? Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall, right? It's not just pride, it's a haughty pride, right? So it's reinforcing the idea. That's a synthetic. The second line completes the thought of the first. And then you have a synonymous parallelism, in which case the second line restates and reinforces the first. It's kind of similar to synthetic, but it's like saying the same thing, but a different way, and saying it right after the other, one right after the other. So the first line says, this is the idea, and the second line says, it's just like this, you see. And an example of that is over in Proverbs 16:18. Oh, excuse me. I just did that. I mixed them up. I'm sorry. I was thinking that I mixed them up. Okay, I apologize for that. So Proverbs 18 is the one that is synonymous, right? Pride goes before destruction. A haughty spirit is linked to pride, right? It's the same thing. So pride, haughty spirit. Destruction, a fall, right? It's just that it reinforces it because it's stating the concept a different way, but in a stronger way to kind of complete the idea. Like I said, it's very similar to synthesis. Now, I'll give you the example of synthesis in a minute. Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit, pride, right? Before a fall, destruction. Okay, so it makes it even stronger. An example of synthesis is 16 verse 4, which is, Yahweh works out everything to its proper end, but it doesn't tell you what the end is in the first part, right? What is the proper end? Even the wicked for a day of disaster, right? Yahweh works out everything to its proper end. And if you left that alone like that, he's like, you're waiting. What is the end? What are you talking about? Even the wicked for a day of disaster. So he completes the thought. The second line completes the thought of the first. Okay? So antithetical is kind of doing a contrast. Usually you have the word but. Sometimes it's the word and or but. It's a contrast, antithetical. You have synthetic, where you're using the second proverb to complete the thought of the first. And then you have synonymous parallelism, which is saying the same thing, but a slightly different way to give you more impact. right? So these pithy sayings stick to the minds of the people that hear them. And since they're most often based upon concrete life examples, right? They talk about the farmer, they talk about the businessman, they talk about the husband, the wife, the child, right? Things that people know, right? Not a bunch of intellectual mumbo jumbo that nobody understands. And have you ever taken a philosophy class in high school or in college? Oh my goodness. In all fairness, it's fascinating stuff, fascinating. And, I don't want to be simplistic about things. Let's just say that many of the great traditions that we have, particularly in Western society, come from as a result of these great philosophers. So I don't want to make it seem like I'm somehow against it or anything, because it's amazing. The capacity of the human mind to come up with some of these concepts is just amazing and astounding to me. That being said, some of the things that you hear is like, where are you coming from? It's like it has no beginning, no end, no. So what it does is it winds up leaving you in confusion. I've literally been in the room that we spent 2 hours trying to figure out if we were actually in the room at all. Are you actually there, or do you just think you're there, right? And there's this value in exercising your mind and coming up with and making you be a thinker. So I'm not knocking that per se, but when it comes time to making decisions on how to live, you need something concrete. And the biblical wisdom is that concreteness, okay? So it's not just meant to be an intellectual exercise. It's meant to be something that will help you to make decisions to live in the day-to-day. Consider the words, for example, of Proverbs 19:12. The king's wrath is as the roaring of a lion, but his favor is as dew upon the grass. Who would not clearly see the stark contrast between the powerful roaring lion versus the mild, gentle dew upon the grass, right? You can see it in your mind's eye. These short maxims then presented a memorable and practical means by which to order one's life. Okay? So when you consider the first 9 chapters of Proverbs, with their emphasis upon avoiding certain behaviors and lifestyles, you see how impactful this can be. These issues include violence, sexual immorality, laziness, dishonesty, and others. So these chapters relate the importance of gaining wisdom. The first 9 chapters, it's the whole thing. The first 9 chapters are an introduction to basically get to whet your appetite to learn wisdom, okay? And then wisdom itself is personified in chapter 8 and in chapters 1:20 to 33. Whoever seeks to live properly must seek wisdom and act upon it, okay? And throughout these proverbs, the very real consequences of disobedience by ignoring wisdom are illustrated, okay? Now, I'm going to skip the information about speculative wisdom because it's not really applicable to our study of Proverbs. And instead, I want to tell you a little bit about Solomon, okay, who is the main writer. But before I talk about Solomon, I do want to take a look at these charts for just a moment. So I'm going to put on screen and particularly, and we probably won't get to everything I wanted to get to today, but that's why I left at least 2 lessons for this, because I knew it was going to be a lot of material. We're going to turn to the chart from Jensen on the survey of Proverbs. So I will turn to that now, and you should see it on your screen momentarily. Let me know if you do see that on screen. Babe, can you text me if you see it on screen? I'm not getting feedback from anyone, so. Oh, I'm getting texted now. Thank you. Yes. Okay, thank you. Okay, so you should see on screen a survey from Irving Jensen, and he was very famous for doing these surveys, by the way. And let's take a look at a general overview of Proverbs here. Okay, and there, by the way, you could talk to 10 different people and get 10 different overviews of Proverbs in terms of the structure. So these are just suggested structures that made sense to me. But there's some generally agreed upon ideas with regard to structure. So in this one here, you have 31. Let me get my my arrow here. So you should see an arrow momentarily. Okay. So you have 31 chapters in the book of Proverbs. Okay. And everyone pretty much agrees that from chapter 1 to the end of chapter 9, okay, from chapter 1 to chapter 9, that's for the most part an introduction to the book of Proverbs. That's where you're laying the foundation. From chapters 1 to 9, you're learning about the reason for the book of Proverbs. You know, why was it created? Why was it developed? You're looking for, or not so much the book of Proverbs, quote unquote, right? Because they weren't thinking about it in terms of a book, but when they compiled this collection of Proverbs, and they were collected by different people over the course of time, this was their intent. The intent of getting the Proverbs is explained in chapters 1 through 9. And it's an explanation of why you want wisdom as compared to being a fool, as compared to folly, right? So everything is about explaining the difference between wisdom and folly and why one, wisdom, is better than the other, folly, okay? And then it goes through some of the major issues of life and how having wisdom puts you in a better position than being a fool. And those issues are the kind of things that I just mentioned. You know, the issue of violence, the issue of sexual immorality is a big issue because it's such a big problem, right? The issue of laziness is a big issue in the book of Proverbs. So those are viewed as some of the bigger overarching issues with which man deals. And chapters 1 through 9 give you they lay the case, they lay the business case, if you will, for walking in the fear of Yahweh, as Irving Jensen titles in this book, in this survey chart, right? Then when you get to chapter 10, that's where the actual individual Proverbs begin. So the actual Proverbs, the collection, Solomon's collection, goes from 10 verse 1 through around 22:16. 10:1 to 22:16, okay? And when you look at his chart, that's reflected here, right? So if you look over here, this entire section here is referred to as the Proverbs of Solomon, right? And that goes from 1 to 22:16. Chapters 1 through 9 being that introduction, and then chapters 10, Proverbs 10:1 to 22:16 being a lot of the individual proverbs that comprise Solomon's collection. When you get to 22:17, there's a bit of a change, and you even see that in the construction of the proverbs. 22:17 begins what is commonly referred to by scholars as the words of the wise, right? So if you let's turn to a couple of passages here. Let's go to Proverbs 1:1. So Proverbs 1:1 says, the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. So immediately we're told who wrote the Proverbs, right? The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. That's very clear. Now, of course, understand you're always going to have scholars that are going to question everything, right? So you're going to have all kinds of opinions. And, well, was this really Solomon? And maybe it was someone who, followed in Solomon's footsteps, and on and on. Yeah, I don't get into those kind of discussions. They bore me anymore, okay? If something is a lot of times scholars do this to sell books, okay, to make a name for themselves, quite frankly. Okay, but those kind of things don't intimidate me anymore. If I see something that is very out of whack, I don't close my eyes to it either, right? Because I'd be a fool to do that, okay? As the book of Proverbs will tell me. But I don't get hung up with issues about, well, was this exactly Solomon, and they did parse this here and then this verse there, and maybe the first part but not the second part, and just don't get caught up in that kind of nonsense, because it's a never-ending battle and you'll never resolve it in this lifetime, okay? But Proverbs 1:1 indicates that these proverbs are Proverbs of Solomon. When you get to 10:17, it changes tenor, right? It's not only the way in which the proverbs are presented, so you know that stylistically they're different, okay? Excuse me, not 10:1, 22:16. 22:16, you see a change, and the proverbs, the way in which they're presented, look different, and there's also a difference in the message, right? So if you go to 22:17, it says, "Pay attention and turn your ear to the sayings of the wise. Apply your heart to what I teach, for it is pleasing when you keep them in your heart and have all of them ready on your lips." So 22:17 refers to sayings of the wise. Some versions say words of the wise. So this is generally viewed to be a work of a group of other wise men. And the wise, we'll talk about that next time some more as we go into part 2 of the introduction. I have a lot more to say that I'm obviously not going to get to today. But the wise were likely men that were of a school of wisdom. There were schools of wisdom in those days. If you look at, for example, the schools, there's a term in Scripture known as the school of the prophets, and you'll see that in the writings. And you'll see that these were wise men who were teaching people the Torah, and they were teaching the implications of the Torah and teaching them to be wise. And these words of the wise likely came from people like that, sages of Israel, who were men renowned for their wisdom and who operated these schools. They were teachers, and they explicitly compiled the Proverbs that you see described from 22:17 all the way through 24, chapter 24. When you get to chapter 25, you have another change in the way that the Proverbs are described. And it says there in 25:1, these are more Proverbs of Solomon compiled by the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah. So this is years later, probably about 200 years later, the men of Hezekiah, in Hezekiah's time, apparently Hezekiah directed some men to compile many of Solomon's Proverbs and put them together. And those will take you from 25:1 through the end of 29. Those are collected by Hezekiah's men. Okay, so Solomon would have lived around 950 or so BCE, before the Common Era. Let me see if my writing is correct there. My time. Yeah, about 971 to 931 is when he would have reigned, at least by one designation. And then Hezekiah's men would have been around 700. So we're talking about 200 years later. And the Hezekiah's men compiled this collection here from 25 to 29. And then when you get to chapter 30, there's another change. And we're not exactly sure who put these together, but chapter 30 refers to someone named Agur. So 30, the sayings of Agur, son of Jakeh, an inspired utterance. And there are a number of translations here that some of them are quite different. And we'll get to that when we get to that, okay? No one really knows who Agur is, for sure, right? Same thing with chapter 31, where you talk about the sayings of King Lemuel, an inspired utterance his mother taught him. Now, there are some people who will say that Agur and Lemuel are just, appellatives of King Solomon, that they were just other names or terms used for Solomon. Personally, I think that's more wishful thinking than anything else. Stylistically, they're quite a bit different than what you see with in the ones that Solomon put together. But to me, that's just kind of the lazy answer. Well, just other name for Solomon. There's evidence that it may be other people, and you can't ignore that evidence. Doesn't matter. They're still words of the wise, right? So it doesn't matter if they were all Solomon, if they were, some Hezekiah's men, some of the words of the wise. They're all, Yahweh inspired them all to eventually get these words in the book in the setting in which we now have them. Okay, so just a quick review: 1:1 to the end of chapter 9. We're talking about an overall introduction to the book of Proverbs and laying the foundation. 10:1 to 22:16 are the actual Proverbs, the main body of Proverbs of Solomon. 22:17 begins the words of the wise, and those go through 24. 25:1 to the end of 29, additional Proverbs of Solomon collected by the men of Hezekiah and put together by the men of Hezekiah. And then chapter 30, the words of Agur. Chapter 31, the words of Lemuel. Okay, and there are other variations of this that I will explain to you next time. Okay, before I close, I just want to see if there are any questions that I am missing. So I'm going to stop sharing this, and we'll come back to this. There's more that he says here about in the prologue, right? And then he has the actual maxims. Maxims are short sayings. Those are the Proverbs. And he talks about an epilogue. He considers chapter 30 and 31 as being part of a grand epilogue. And then this is Jensen. And then he gives you the purpose of the Proverbs in each of these sections here. So we'll complete this chart, Yahweh willing, next time. And we will also talk about Chuck Swindoll's designation. And you can look at those in the course of the week, right? Let me before I go to the questions, let me share the timeline for just a moment, because I think that might be helpful to you. Oh, that's the one I just did. So give me a moment. I don't think I opened that one up. Okay, give me a second. I will open it up. And this is so you can get a better sense of the dates in which they were written. So let me go to switch screen. For some reason it's not coming up. Try this again. There it is. Okay, so you should see this coming up in just a moment here. So this shows you the dates of the writing of Proverbs. So if you just kind of, let me make this just a little bit larger there. Okay, so if you look all the way to the left, you see that Moses is placed at around 1500 BCE. And of course, you know, scholars have all kinds of debate over this. This is just a general idea. 1500, around 1425, Joshua the general. Then the period of Judges, the period between around 1400 to 1043. Then you have the monarchy, right? So Saul starts around 1043. David around 1012. These are the kings of the United Kingdom, right? So notice here that most of the Psalms are written here by King David. David is credited for roughly about 70 plus of the Psalms of the 150. And that's another study that we could do and spend months on. And then most of the Proverbs are written here. That's another fascinating study, by the way, about Proverbs. Psalms. And then most of the Proverbs are written here by King Solomon. And notice the dates here from about 971 to 931. And dates are all, dates are one of those things that you have, multiple scholarly opinions, but roughly around the 900s, before the Common Era, King Solomon. So this is all kind of giving you some perspective, right? So you have, after Solomon, you have the kings of Israel, the northern kingdom, and then they go into Assyrian captivity around 722, and scholars generally agree on that date. And also in the same period, overlapping, you have the kings of Judah and the southern kingdom, okay? And then that goes on until about 586 BCE, where they go into Babylonian captivity. Now, the Proverbs that are from chapter 25 to 29, chapters 25 to 29 of Proverbs are written right about here. And they're compiled, not written, excuse me, but they're compiled by the men of Hezekiah. So the men of Hezekiah did not write them, understand. They just pulled them together and put them in an orderly fashion. And by the way, some of those wise men may have included prophets. They might have included the prophet Isaiah. They might have included the prophet Micah, who were contemporaries of Hezekiah. So when they talk about the wise men, it may very well have been some of those prophets that were included among them. No one knows for sure. But notice here, collection of Proverbs by Hezekiah's aides. And in this entire period, all the prophetic books are written here. And then, of course, the restoration begins around 536. And then it goes on to about 400, around the time of Ezra, the scribe. Okay, so that just kind of gives you a bit of a timeline there. All right, let me see if there are any questions. I think that's probably a good place to stop. There's more that I could say, but I want to leave that as a complete unit till the next time we get together. So, did any questions come in that you wanted me to attend to, Saida? You were kind of monitoring that. Or if you do have any questions that you wanted me regarding this material, any questions that you wanted me to address, and if I can address it now, I will. If not, I will research it and get back with you. We still have about 7-8 minutes here. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and type them in the chat now. I'll be happy to answer whatever we can. Okay, you didn't see any you couldn't answer. Good. Okay. But yep, we have time, so please, by all means, go ahead and type in any questions you may have. Anything that I've mentioned or anything about the Proverbs in general that you'd like me to focus on? Nothing? Okay. All right. Well, then I'll tell you what then. I'll use another 5 minutes, and I'll just introduce us to Chuck Swindoll's chart since we're here. So let's go to take a look at Chuck's chart. And again, you see, a similar type of setup, right? Let me get my pointer. Okay. So notice he has also chapters 1 through 9 as sort of the introduction. He refers to it as a prologue, right? Prologue to wise living. And I like the way Chuck presented it because he's putting in some representative verses, right? So for him, between chapters 1 through 9, a key verse is the fear of Yahweh is the beginning of knowledge, which is absolutely accurate in my view. Then once you get to chapter 10, verse 1, he kind of lumps them all in together, right? 10:1 through 31:9. So he gives you all the Proverbs here. So he doesn't break them down in the same way that Jensen does. But most scholars will break them down like Jensen does. I know that Chuck Swindoll, he also knows that division exists, but he's trying to present it in a simpler way for preaching purposes. So he just calls these the principles for wise living. In other words, all the Proverbs. And his key center here is Proverbs 15:33. The fear of Yahweh is the instruction for wisdom, and before honor comes humility. So he sees honor as being a prerequisite to accepting the Proverbs in your life. And then he uses chapter 31, 10 to 31, which is, of course, what we know as the Ashes Chayil, the worthy woman. That's the passage on the worthy woman. He uses that as a final commentary on wise living, right? And I kind of like the way he presents. It's very interesting to see how different people characterize their charts and their surveys. And when you're reading through different material, you always want to take note of that, how different people interpret. So this is very interesting. Prologue, he considers chapters 1 through 9 a prologue to wise living, and that's accurate. That's the introduction, it's laying the foundation. And then all the actual principles from 10:1 to 31:9, but that's through the words of Agur, and actually into Lemuel's words. And then he used that last section as the personification of wise living, where the key is charm is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears Yahweh, she shall be praised. In other words, why does he say that? Because he views that passage of the wise woman as a final example of what a wise person looks like, right? So in other words, in the first 9 chapters, we learn, here's why you should want wisdom. And then chapters 10 through 31:9, this is what wisdom actually looks like, right? And this is how you live if you want to be wise. And then chapter 31, 10 to 31, here's a final example, a model of someone who put these things into practice, you see. And then he goes through the different emphases here. So he sees the first 9 chapters referring to mainly wisdom, especially for youth. I'm not so sure I agree with that, but I understand why he would say that. And then he says the rest of it, wisdom for all. Well, I don't particularly agree with that, and I'll tell you why when we get to it, but it's a nice little subdivision just to get you thinking. There's a framework here, right? A framework is what? A framework is kind of an outline upon which you hang everything else, right? If you have a frame behind me, you see this, it's more than a frame, right? But if you look at the frame is what encapsulates the actual substance. So the frame, he says that each of these sections constitutes a framework for everything within. So chapters 1 through 9 introduces all the subjects and major statements about wisdom. Then the actual sections of the Proverbs talk about people and their problems, right? And then this personification is something that you can use for counseling and correction to show people an example of how to live. The style of the entire book is what I've really heavily relied on during this first introductory session here, right? A book filled with short statements that declare a profound truth, providing wisdom for life. That's a mouthful, right? Proverbs is a book filled with short statements that declare a profound truth, or really many profound truths, providing wisdom for life, practical wisdom for life, right? And he finds as the key theme for the entire book, the fear of Yahweh is the beginning of wisdom, as I do, and the key verse, 9:10. And then, interestingly enough, he also adds this, as does Jensen, he finds Messiah in Proverbs, and he uses this verse, wisdom is incarnate in Messiah. Well, not verse, but he uses the statement. Wisdom is incarnate. In other words, Messiah in his flesh represents wisdom, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. which he takes from passages such as 1 Corinthians 1:24 and 30 and Colossians 2:3. And I believe that that's true as well. And I believe that specifically chapter 8 of the book of Proverbs is a very poetic description of the character of Yahshua the Messiah. Proverbs 8 is exclusively dedicated to wisdom speaking and describing herself. And I view that as being characteristics that you can directly associate to Yahshua the Messiah. Many scholars identify that as Messiah personified as wisdom in chapter 8. And then chapter 9 further builds upon that and talks about wisdom to an even greater extent. But 8 is wisdom actually speaking in a poetic form. So we'll talk about that when we get there. Okay, so this is where we're heading. We're going to talk a little bit more about who wrote the book. We'll talk a little bit more, well, a lot more about Solomon. I have a whole series of things to say about Solomon, and we're going to talk about a little bit more about the wise, and a little bit maybe about Agur and Lemuel, just a little bit more about who wrote it. And then I'm going to give you some general impressions about the book of Proverbs, and then we're going to go into the actual text. So we should be able to get through the introduction, Yahweh willing, next week. And then by week 3, we will go into Proverbs 1. And by the way, since much of that material has already been covered in the introduction, I anticipate that we're going to get through chapter 1 fairly quickly in terms of the practicalness of it. So that's where we are, and that's where we're headed. All right. So I want to thank you for your attention. One last call. Any questions about the book of Proverbs or anything that I've talked about thus far? Going once. And twice. Okay. Well, I want to thank you all very much for your attention. May Yahweh bless you. If I don't hear from you, we have another hour or so to complete Sabbath. So I'm going to turn off the recording, and then we will say a prayer. And thank you. We will say a prayer and then conclude for the day. So let me just stop recording, and we will conclude for the day.